Patton's temper was legendary long before it became controversial. It was sharp, explosive, and unapologetically raw. To his soldiers, it was often electrifying. To his enemies, terrifying. And to his fellow generals, especially Omar Bradley, it was a constant source of unease. Patton did not merely command armies. He overwhelmed them with force of personality. But behind the victories and speeches, Bradley saw something few others were willing to confront openly. Patton's temper was both his greatest weapon and his most dangerous liability. Omar Bradley was not blind to Patton's brilliance. He admired his speed, his instincts, and his ability to inspire men to move when exhaustion said they could not. But Bradley also understood something deeper: war magnified personality. Under pressure, men did not become better versions of themselves. They became more fully who they already were. And Patton, under pressure, burned hotter. Bradley had known Patton for years. They had trained together, risen together, and fought alongside one another across North Africa and Europe. Bradley had watched Patton dominate battlefields and command attention wherever he went. Yet Bradley had also watched moments when Patton's temper threatened to undo everything his talent achieved. These moments did not always make headlines. Some were quiet, others contained behind closed doors. But Bradley never forgot them. The most famous incidents, the slapping episodes in Sicily, were only the surface. They revealed what Bradley already feared: that Patton's emotional volatility, when unchecked, could cross lines that no victory could justify. Publicly, Bradley defended discipline and order. Privately, he carried the burden of knowing that one man's anger could end careers, damage morale, and compromise the moral authority of the Allied cause. Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, relied heavily on Bradley's judgment. Ike valued Patton's aggression, but he trusted Bradley's restraint. Between them existed a quiet understanding. Bradley would be honest when others were cautious. And when it came to Patton's temper, honesty became unavoidable. Bradley did not rush to Eisenhower with accusations or dramatics. He chose his moments carefully, knowing that Patton was too valuable to discard lightly and too volatile to ignore indefinitely. Bradley framed his concerns not as complaints, but as warnings, measured, professional, and rooted in concern for the larger mission. Privately, Bradley told Eisenhower that Patton was a commander who operated on emotion as much as intellect. He explained that Patton's anger fueled his drive, but also narrowed his judgment. When Patton felt challenged, criticized, or slowed, his temper flared, not just in words, but in decisions. Bradley worried that Patton's inability to restrain himself emotionally could one day force Eisenhower into an impossible choice. What troubled Bradley most was not Patton's anger toward the enemy. That, Bradley believed, was expected in war. What troubled him was Patton's anger toward his own men. Bradley believed leadership required control, especially when those under command were frightened, exhausted, or broken. And Patton's temper, when unleashed downward, risked breaking trust. Bradley reportedly told Eisenhower that Patton needed boundaries, not to weaken him, but to protect him. He described Patton as a racehorse that could win any contest if guided correctly, but would destroy itself if allowed to run unchecked. It was not condemnation. It was concern. Eisenhower listened carefully. He had seen Patton's temper himself, though often filtered through reports and reputation. Ike understood that Patton's energy was irreplaceable, especially in moments when momentum mattered. But Eisenhower also understood Bradley's warning that unchecked brilliance could become uncontrollable. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower began to rely even more on Bradley as a moderating force. Bradley became, in effect, a buffer, shielding Patton from his own worst impulses while shielding the command structure from Patton's volatility. It was an unspoken role, heavy with responsibility and emotional strain. Bradley felt torn. He believed in Patton's ability to win battles, but he feared the consequences if Patton lost control at the wrong moment. War did not forgive public mistakes easily. One emotional outburst, one poorly judged act, could hand propaganda to the enemy and undermine Allied legitimacy. In moments of reflection, Bradley admitted to himself that Patton frightened him, not because he lacked discipline on the battlefield, but because his temper followed no map. It could ignite without warning, and when it did, even victory could not justify the damage. As the war pressed on, Bradley's private conversations with Eisenhower grew more urgent. Patton's temper was not diminishing, it was intensifying. The pressure of command, the speed of operations, and Patton's belief in his own destiny all fed the fire. Bradley sensed that a reckoning was coming. The question was not whether Patton would test the limits again. The question was whether the command structure would be ready when he did. And when that moment arrived, Bradley knew his words to Eisenhower, spoken quietly, privately, and without drama, might determine not just Patton's future, but the moral direction of the Allied command itself. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Europe, the pressure on every commander intensified. Victory no longer depended solely on bold movement or clever tactics. It depended on restraint, judgment, and control. For George Patton, this phase of the war proved the most dangerous, not because the enemy was stronger, but because his own temperament was under constant strain. Omar Bradley saw it clearly, and so did Dwight Eisenhower. The difference was that Bradley felt it was his responsibility to say something before the consequences became irreversible. Patton's temper did not always explode publicly. Often, it simmered beneath the surface, surfacing in sharp words, dismissive gestures, and impulsive decisions. Bradley noticed how Patton reacted to delays, criticism, or any hint of limitation. He bristled at oversight. He interpreted caution as weakness, and when his authority felt challenged, his anger sharpened into something personal. Bradley quietly documented these moments, not as evidence against Patton, but as signals of a growing problem. He saw how Patton's frustration with logistical delays sometimes translated into pressure on exhausted units. He saw how Patton's intolerance for hesitation could overwhelm junior officers, already stretched to their limits. Bradley believed that leadership under fire required empathy as much as aggression, and Patton struggled with the former. In private meetings with Eisenhower, Bradley spoke with increasing urgency. He explained that Patton's temper was not isolated to one or two incidents. It was a pattern. Bradley emphasized that Patton's brilliance made him dangerous when unchecked, because success reinforced his belief that his instincts justified everything. Eisenhower listened carefully, understanding that removing Patton was not a simple option. The Third Army's momentum was critical to Allied success. Eisenhower wrestled with an internal conflict that few could appreciate. Patton was a weapon, perhaps the most effective one in the Allied arsenal. But weapons, if mishandled, could harm those who wielded them. Eisenhower relied on Bradley to help him decide when to restrain Patton and when to unleash him. One particular moment crystallized Bradley's concern. Patton's public comments, sharp, controversial, and often unfiltered, began attracting unwanted attention. Bradley warned Eisenhower that Patton's words, driven by emotion rather than calculation, risked undermining Allied unity and public trust. War, Bradley reminded Ike, was fought not only on the battlefield, but in the court of opinion. Bradley told Eisenhower that Patton needed supervision, not punishment. He argued that outright removal would damage morale and squander Patton's talents, but inaction would invite disaster. The solution, Bradley believed, lay in structure, clear limits, firm guidance, and constant oversight. It was an uncomfortable compromise, but one Bradley felt was necessary. Eisenhower agreed, reluctantly. Behind the scenes, Patton's leash was tightened. His public statements were monitored. His operational freedom, while still significant, was more carefully framed. Patton sensed the change immediately. To him, it felt like mistrust. His temper flared not in explosions, but in resentment. Bradley became the intermediary, absorbing Patton's frustration while maintaining Eisenhower's confidence. It was an exhausting role. Bradley believed deeply in Patton's ability to win battles, but he also believed that leadership required accountability. Each time Patton pushed against restraint, Bradley felt the tension pull tighter. There were moments when Bradley wondered if Patton understood the danger he posed to himself. Success had shielded him for so long that consequences felt distant. Bradley feared that Patton's temper would eventually cross a line that no amount of battlefield success could erase. Eisenhower shared this fear. In private, he confided to Bradley that Patton was his own worst enemy. It was an admission that carried weight. The Supreme Commander knew that the very qualities that made Patton invaluable also made him unpredictable. As the war accelerated toward its final phase, Bradley sensed that time was running out, not just for Germany, But for Patton, the margin for error was shrinking. The world was watching more closely, and Patton's temper showed no signs of cooling. Bradley's private counsel to Eisenhower became more direct. He urged Ike to prepare for the possibility that Patton might have to be sidelined, not as punishment, but as protection for the Allied mission. It was a painful thought, one Bradley did not voice lightly. He understood that removing Patton would feel like amputating a limb in the middle of a race. Yet Bradley believed that leadership sometimes required choosing between brilliance and stability. And as he weighed Patton's temper against the moral authority of the Allied cause, he feared that one uncontrolled moment could undo years of sacrifice. The line was bending, and Bradley knew that if it broke, history would not judge intentions, only outcomes. By the final months of the war, George Patton's Third Army was racing across Germany with a speed that stunned both allies and enemies. The battlefield victories were undeniable. Yet for Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower, triumph came with a constant undercurrent of anxiety. They were no longer asking whether Patton could win battles. They were asking whether he could restrain himself long enough to finish the war without damaging the cause he fought for. Bradley's private warnings to Eisenhower had changed how Patton was handled. Ike did not strip Patton of command, but he did something more subtle and perhaps more painful. He limited him. Patton was watched more closely than ever before. His statements were filtered. His impulses were checked. The man who thrived on absolute freedom now felt the invisible weight of supervision. Patton sensed this shift and reacted as Bradley had feared. His temper did not explode outward, it turned inward. Frustration hardened into bitterness. He felt misunderstood, underappreciated, and constrained by men he believed lacked his fire. Bradley saw this clearly and felt a quiet sadness. He understood Patton's pain, but he also knew the stakes were too high to indulge it. In private conversations with Eisenhower, Bradley admitted that restraining Patton was like caging a storm. Necessary, but unnatural. He told Ike that Patton would never be comfortable with limits, and that any attempt to control him would always carry risk. But Bradley also insisted that allowing Patton's temper to run free would carry greater risk still. Eisenhower agreed. He valued Patton, but he valued the integrity of the Allied command more. Ike believed that victory without discipline would be hollow, and that leadership required moral authority as well as military success. Bradley's counsel reinforced this belief. Together, they chose restraint over spectacle. As Germany collapsed, the feared catastrophe never came. Patton did not commit the single act that would force Eisenhower's hand. The war ended before Patton's temper could undo him. Bradley felt relief, not triumph. He believed they had escaped danger, not conquered it. In the months after the war, as Patton struggled to adapt to peacetime realities, Bradley reflected on everything that had transpired. He did not see Patton as a villain or a hero, but as a profoundly human figure, brilliant, flawed, and ultimately limited by his own intensity. Bradley believed Patton was born for war, but war was not built to contain men like him indefinitely. When Bradley later spoke of Patton, his words were careful and compassionate. He praised Patton's courage and speed, but he also acknowledged his volatility. He never revealed every private warning he had given Eisenhower, but those close to him understood the truth. Bradley had helped save Patton from himself as much as he had helped save the Allied command from scandal. Eisenhower, too, carried this understanding. In later reflections, he admitted that Patton was indispensable, but also exhausting. The balance they struck, guided by Bradley's quiet honesty, allowed Patton to finish the war as a victorious commander rather than a disgraced one. History would remember Patton for his speeches, his audacity, and his relentless drive. It would remember Bradley for his steadiness, his restraint, and his loyalty to principle. What history would not easily see were the private conversations, the warnings spoken softly, and the decisions made in silence. Yet those moments mattered. What Bradley privately told Eisenhower about Patton's temper was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of leadership. Bradley understood that true command sometimes meant protecting even the most gifted men from their own worst impulses. In the end, Patton won battles. Bradley preserved the army. Eisenhower held the alliance together. And the war was won not just by fire and steel, but by the courage to speak the truth, even when it had to be spoken in private.